Hi everyone, my name is Kabir Panahi. Today Lucy and I will present our work about election security in Afghanistan's 2019 election. There has been extensive research on electoral technology used in the US and other established nations, but little focus given on the countries with emerging democracies. Afghanistan's use of BVV presents a unique opportunity to explore these technologies in a different context. We were able to do this work because I worked for Afghan Election Commission in 2019, and also Shawn, the second author, has a US military background with the tour in Afghanistan. First, some background about elections in Afghanistan. Despite decades of armed conflict, instability, and war, Afghanistan has held several elections. Starting in 2004, the country held presidential and parliamentary elections every 5 years with total 8 elections until August 2021 when the Taliban took over the country. However, each elections prior to the 2019 presidential election was marked with allegation of systematic fraud and ballot stuffing. The new elected government, in a response to this fraud, promised to regain public trust in 2019 election. The government's promise was biometric voter verification technology, or I'm going to call BVV for the rest of the presentation. The Afghan government deployed BVV devices in the 2019 presidential election for the first time nationally with the aim to ensure one voter, one vote. To do this, they contracted a European company to design and develop the Android-based BVV devices, which included sensors to collect fingerprint and photos of registered voters on the election day. And at the end of the day, election workers were supposed to transmit voter biometrics to the deduplication servers over the cell network. Then the server would compare the collected biometrics and voter IDs to remove duplicate voters. Afterwards, the result would be announced according to an established timeline. This sounds promising and fast, right? But it was actually a mess on election day and afterwards. There are documented stories of poll workers not being able to use the devices in the right way, people not being able to cast the votes not being counted, and in the end, there was a 5 months of delay in announcing results. In those 5 months, there was a lot of turmoil and disputes between two candidates about how to count the votes, biases, and etc. And at the center of all these problems were BVV as the new central element in the 2019 election. Now I would like to talk about research goals. In this work, we wanted to learn more about BVV as the new important voter-facing technology in 2019 election. We explored several key questions. How was BVV adopted? Why BVV adopted? How BVV integrated into the electoral system? And finally, we examined the consequences of this technology from political, administrative, and security perspectives. However, this paper is not about deciding whether the idea of biometric technology is good or bad. We are also not blaming anyone in particular. Following our research question, I'd like to talk about our methodology. We have adopted qualitative analysis for this work. Me and Shawn conducted 18 interviews with Afghan and international electoral experts from various backgrounds who directly worked were involved with BVV in the 2019 elections. The interviews were conducted in English and Dari, which is the national language of Afghanistan. I would also to talk about safety and ethics in this research. To conduct this research safely and ethically, we have disclosed our findings with the vendor. We also obtained IRB approval from our institution and de-identified our transcript to ensure participants' anonymity. Additionally, due to the sensitive nature of our research topic and threats from the Taliban to the previous Afghan officials, we discussed the risk with each and every participant and ensure they feel safe prior to conducting this interview. Now we are going to talk about our results, starting from with electoral goals. These goals, voter enfranchisement, anti-fraud, and increased public trust, are set with regards to integration of BVV in the 2019 Afghan election. These goals were qualitatively drawn from thematic analysis of our data, and also we made the framing of support and violation to help researchers and practitioners digest our results.
Thanks. So now we'll go through a few examples of the technical functionality and security issues with the BVVs. And the first example has to do with the timestamps. So Afghan law said that in order for a vote to be valid, it had to be cast between 7 a.m. and 5 p.m. on election day. And the timestamp was set on the vote was the timestamp of the BVV. The two were the same. And the problem is the time and date of the BVVs were set manually rather than automatically by the central election workers in Kabul before the election. And then the BVVs were sent out to polling centers. This manual effort is significant because there were approximately 39,000 BVVs that were distributed across Afghanistan. This means that when the BVVs were turned on at the polling centers, some of them displayed incorrect times. For example, here we have 7 p.m. in September 2029. So this is 10 years ahead of time, and AM and PM are switched. This issue affected approximately 102,000 votes, which is about 5% of all votes. And here's a quote from someone who's explaining it. This participant said, "These irregular votes, they were considered fraud. Some devices were set up wrongly to be in 2029. We can't say it's fraud, but it's likely the mistake of the person who configured the device." So going back to electoral goals, this burden on the electoral workers led to voter disenfranchisement and a loss of public trust. And this emphasizes that the system's design, the design of the BVVs, didn't match with the on-the-ground realities of the workers' roles. There were other issues as well. Another one is that the BVVs ran very slowly in the heat, and some of the polling centers were extremely hot. This participant estimated that it took 3 minutes for each voter to vote when the BVVs were sluggish. The polls were open for 10 hours. There were 300 people designated for each BVV. And if you do that math, it doesn't work out. And that's what this participant is saying. If everybody had shown up, they would have turned away voters. So we consider this a design mismatch of the BVV with the physical landscape of Afghanistan. Back to you.
Some participants told us that very use of technology in the election made people safe voting. And this is support of voter enfranchisement goal. Other participants told us that people did not vote because of technology, because the Taliban threatened to identify and harm voters by accessing the biometric database, which signifies BVV design mismatch with the socio-political landscape of the country.
So we also learned that the use of photographs precluded some women from voting. This participant talked about how, quote, in a conservative society like Afghanistan, men didn't allow their wives or daughters to be photographed, which meant that they couldn't vote. This isn't all women in Afghanistan. A lot of women voted in this election. But this means that the BVV design was mismatched with the cultural values in parts of Afghanistan.
The BVV also had an effect on fraud. Participants said that BVVs seemed to prevent or deter systematic frauds that was prevalent in prior elections. This code talks about how in earlier elections there was ballot stuffing, but this BVV worked as a deterrent this time. The credibility of this code can be supported with comparison of previous elections. Voter turnout, for example, 7 million votes in 2014, as opposed to 1.8 million here.
So there are more examples in our paper about how the design of the biometric voter verification devices were not well suited to the context in Afghanistan. But to recap, we found that there were misalignments between who developers expected users to be and who users actually were. There were also misalignments between the physical landscape, including weather and infrastructure, and what the devices were designed for. And another issue stemmed from the role of electoral workers in using and setting up the devices. This role was sometimes a burden and sometimes a privilege that might have been misplaced. One of the amazing things about talking to electoral experts, people who were actually there and worked on the election, is that they started to tell us why these issues occurred. So one issue is that they simply didn't have enough time, as this quote says, to train staff and configure and deploy the devices. Another issue regarding planning and deployment was the fact that the Afghan government, and therefore the designers of the technology, really didn't have a clear statistical and scientific picture of the demography of the country. There was no reliable national census. And finally, a lot of participants talked about the poor relationship between the vendor and the Afghan agencies who were deploying the biometric devices. This is a critical relationship to nurture and protect for security, and it wasn't necessarily there in Afghanistan. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are a lot of things that came up from the participants in our paper. So the question is, how do we move forward and build better electoral systems? And what do we learn from this work? This is really difficult because there are not elections in Afghanistan right now. We can't apply our findings directly to the context that we studied. But the individual stories about how the technology failed to serve its people, the broader framing of support and violation of electoral goals, and how and why it failed and succeeded in Afghanistan, this is something that we believe can help future electoral designers and researchers. Thank you for listening, and we'd be happy to take questions about any of this talk.